You you or one of your colleagues will have the slides and recordings
We're all
available.
We're
set.
all ready to go. Well, good
Yes.
afternoon, everyone. So thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Aisha Dixon. I'm the director of the Emeriti Retirees Relations Center at UCLA. And with us, we work hand in hand with our Retiree Association and our Emeriti Association. And they're bringing to you a very special program today. So Steve, I'm gonna mute everyone and then hand it over to you.
Okay.
Hang on, Steve, you got to unmute first, and then we'll go ahead and get you going, okay?
I have to welcome, of course, our speaker today, and not slip and introduce him as the late Bill Kinderman. Professor Kinderman is, according to the website of the School of Music, is a formidable concert pianist, chamber musician, and international authority on music and the creative process of Beethoven. Now, of course, I looked him up on Google, and I had no idea when we invited you, Bill, what a international reputation you had. So we really are pleased to have you. Bill is the inaugural holder of the Klein and Klein Chair in Performance Studies, and he's a professor of music at the Herb Alpert School. In other words, Bill is a performer, a scholar, and a thinking musician. At least those are my words. In addition to his heralded piano performances, he's the author of multiple books, one of which, or one area of which he will discuss today. He's an authority on Beethoven. This is his second Beethoven book. And in the website, it says Beethoven, A Political Life. But of course, we're now dealing with a somewhat other title. But Bill is renowned, and UCLA is lucky to have him, and we are lucky to have him as our speaker today. So welcome, Bill. Just have at it. And unmute. You're mute.
Hang on, there we go. Okay.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I believe we're looking at the first, at the group of slides. Let me just, if we could go to number 1.
Mhm.
Okay, we're gonna pull up the slides. Are you ready for that, Michael?
Working on it.
Okay.
So in turning to Beethoven's career, and in completing the book that you kindly mentioned, Stephen, with the title Beethoven, a Political Artist in Revolutionary Times, I was quite struck by both the drama of the historical background that Beethoven experienced and its relevance to our own times. Imagine this, Beethoven, at the time he reached university age, enrolled at the University of Bonn in the year of the Revolution, 1789, when the French Revolution broke out in nearby France. And among his teachers were some mentors who were passionately attached to the principles of the French Revolution, liberty and equality. And very soon thereafter, in 1792, Beethoven moved as an ambitious and distinguished young composer from Bonn in the Rhineland to Vienna, the capital of the Austrian monarchy. And this is a crucial historical juncture because the emperor at Austria for the entire time of Beethoven's residence there from 1792 until 1827 was Emperor Franz, who was none other than the nephew of Marie Antoinette, who through a political marriage had become Queen of France, but then with her husband, the king, had been imprisoned and then decapitated by guillotine in 1793, very shortly after Beethoven arrived in the Austrian capital. So, in short, the historical drama and backdrop here is that when Beethoven, as a young intellectual and composer and keyboard player, goes from the politically progressive Rhineland to Vienna, he goes to a culturally rich environment which was just then experiencing a reactionary political turn to the right. And the explanation for that, in short, is simply that Emperor Franz would do anything possible to prevent a similar revolution breaking out in Austria. So there was rigid censorship, there were political purges. Beethoven had to be extremely careful how he expressed his sympathies for the principles of the French Revolution, and indeed, in the later 1790s, his sympathy for Napoleon Bonaparte when Napoleon Bonaparte was first consul of the French Republic. And if you recall the general historical situation, Napoleon Bonaparte was widely regarded in the later 1790s as a progressive figure. And I'll give you one example that I'm sure is not familiar to anyone here. It's connected to the famous hero of the American Revolution. A figure who, maybe more than any other individual, helped make the revolution successful. He rode next to George Washington and gave substantial financial support to the revolutionaries during the revolutionary time. And this was the Marquis de Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette was familiar to Beethoven for another reason, because in the 1780s, which in Europe was generally speaking a rather progressive period politically, Friedrich Schiller, the poet and philosopher and dramatist, who was a huge influence on Beethoven, wrote a play, Don Carlos, in which there's one figure in the drama named the Marquis de Posa, who is more or less a progressive political figure, almost drawn out of the contemporary period of the 1780s. And his model for that was none other than the Marquis de Lafayette. And hence Beethoven, in his last years in Bonn, in the end of the 1780s, early 1790s, was absolutely enthused by this material. And this is the same period when he became interested in the Ode to Joy, also by Schiller, which eventually crowns his Ninth Symphony, and which then becomes such a celebrated work right up to the present day, standing for affirmative culture, resistance to oppression, response to terrorism and privation, and which has become a kind of artistic figurehead from Beijing in 1989, Tiananmen Square, to the fall of the Berlin Wall that same year, and when Bernstein conducted it and changed the text, making it an ode to freedom instead of an ode to joy. So in short, Friedrich Schiller's legacy and this liberalizing spirit associated with the principles of the French Revolution, but not with the actuality of the French Revolution, which then turned violent in the nightmarish terror of 1793 to 94. This very progressive spirit is what Beethoven takes to heart. And um, he arrives in Vienna in 1792, and then in the later 1790s, he encounters a different and very personal problem. That is, he realizes he can no longer hear properly. He's starting not to hear the upper registers, wind instruments that are playing in the high range. And so in 1802, at this point, we can look at the first picture here at the view of Heiligenstadt, um, which is where Beethoven went. It's a village of 400, now incorporated into the city of Vienna, on the north side, close to the picturesque hills of the Kahlenberg. Um, and Beethoven then takes a half year off, goes on a kind of sabbatical, and works in this village. And I believe we have a sound example that accompanies this. I believe what you'll hear here is my performance of music of the finale of the Tempest Sonata that Beethoven writes at this time. So why don't we go ahead and hear it? That's the first section of the last movement of this sonata, which has an association that's never been exactly confirmed, but which is fascinating, to Shakespeare's late play, one of his last works, The Tempest. It's true, by the way, that although there's sometimes been skepticism about that connection, that the Beethoven documents show that he was capable of seeing himself as Prospero. And maybe he did regard himself as a kind of exiled sorcerer, which is the status of this famous figure in Shakespeare's Tempest. There is a kind of sense in which the sorcerer figure or the artist figure of Prospero corresponds to Beethoven at a time when he is searching for a new approach to his art. This coincided with his personal crisis over his deafness, and a document was discovered after Beethoven died in 1827 called the Heiligenstadt Testament, in which Beethoven explained that he had gone to this village on the advice of his doctor seeking an improvement in his hearing, that the improvement in his hearing did not happen. It withered like the autumn leaves, he wrote in October of that year. And he also wrote that he considered ending his life since he was despairing over this condition. He didn't want to tell anyone in the competitive artistic environment of Vienna that he was losing his hearing, the one sense that he regarded as most important. But he rejected the idea of suicide in favor of a renewed commitment to his art. And this has always exerted a lot of fascination, that you have a handicapped artist who then becomes a kind of deaf seer, so to speak, um, because by general consent, the most impactful music that Beethoven composed altogether in the last decade of his life was a period when he was virtually stone deaf. So if we turn to the next image, why don't we look at the next? Yeah, that is a facsimile of the end of this famous document, the Heiligenstadt Testament, a private document. You see Ludwig van Beethoven written on the right-hand side down below, the date 1802, and something that no one knew about until it was found in a concealed drawer in his desk after Beethoven died in March 1827. So let's move to the next image. And this is an allegorical picture that is held in the Beethoven Museum in Vienna that you can visit if you travel to Vienna now that the pandemic is loosening its hold. You can spend a day or at least a few hours where Beethoven spent this important pivotal half year in 1802. And the picture that was this portrait by Willebrod Mailer is quite interesting from the standpoint of understanding Beethoven's um, aesthetic and even his political convictions. Um, because, as I mentioned, the political environment in Vienna in these years was very restrictive. And if you had liberal ideas or if you had kind of sympathies toward the French Revolution or toward Napoleon Bonaparte, even during the time he was not yet emperor, one had to be very careful about expressing these. There's one traveler who reported that at the beginning of the 1800s, he disturbed the serenity of a Viennese coffee house simply by whistling the Marseillaise, the famous tune that became the French national anthem. France was, in other words, at war repeatedly with Austria. It was the enemy. And at the same time, it was the nation up until the early 1800s that held a more kind of liberalizing political view. So if we look at this picture of the young Beethoven, there are a number of things that stand out. You see Beethoven in his left hand holding a lyre type instrument. It's kind of lyre guitar. And from his posture, then he's kind of like an Apollo or Orpheus like figure. Um, and Mailer himself, when interviewed about the picture, he pointed out the fact that Beethoven, looking at us quite intensely, is depicted as it were thinking of his art, thinking of music, and then he's holding up his right hand. That's the right hand of the virtuoso pianist. um, and so he's quasi conducting, thinking of music and holding an instrument in his left hand. So the musician, so to speak, in action. Now, if you look at the background, that's important too. You notice that on the left-hand side, as we look at the picture, there's a clearing and there is light. On the right-hand side, it's dark. On the right-hand side, you see a kind of dark and somewhat decrepit, dying tree. On the left-hand side, you see two vigorous, younger conifer trees, and behind it, a temple of Apollo, as the painter described it. The Apollo temple fits to the idea of the composer, the musician, as a kind of Orpheus-like figure, and the trees are also important because in this language, in which many things couldn't be said so much in words because they were strictly censored, in musical art, or in this case, in pictorial art, things could be depicted that could be risky to say outright. In short, what this seems to indicate is that what Beethoven turns his back on here is the ancien regime. It's the old decrepit tree. He's moving toward the clearing and the light. Um, and the pair of trees behind his right hand are probably representative of freedom trees. Now, freedom trees, there was a huge moat of them at the time. It started actually in Boston in the 1760s in resistance to the British with the Stamp Act. And the colonists who were resisting the British gathered at a huge elm tree, and the British military regime thus cut down the tree, whereupon freedom trees sprung up everywhere through the colonies. And then they spread to France in the period around 1790, and then to the German-speaking countries later on. And the next image gives us a picture from Bonn. If we move to the next, or actually this is, let's look at this too. You see, this is an allegorical image also relevant, in which the central figure is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is rescuing France. France is the lady to his right, our left, who's being dragged down by ignorance into the abyss. Whereas Napoleon rescuing France in this kind of propagandistic image is pulling her toward abundance and prosperity. Um, in other words, toward the light. And if we look at and significant in this vein is also, by the way, the haircut. If we go back to the Beethoven image for a second, the previous image, yeah, you see Beethoven is also wearing his hair a la Titus, because there was a great vein of the Voltaire play in which the main figure embodied the figure Titus. And so if you wanted to express your sympathies toward the principles of the French Revolution in the 1790s, what you did was you did not wear a wig. Beethoven refused to do that, to wear court dress or wear wig. Instead, you cut you had your hair cut in this choppy style. And that showed that you had Republican sympathies. Women did it too in that period. So now if we move back again to the next image with Napoleon, and then beyond it to the next image, beyond that, there is a statuette of Lucius Brutus that Beethoven himself owned. That's, by the way, not the Brutus who is supposed to, in the Shakespeare play, to have murdered Caesar, but rather the earlier Lucius Brutus, who was a founding consul of the French Republic. And since in France of the 1790s, they were trying to reestablish a republic, this Lucius Brutus became a much imitated figure. And the fact that Beethoven even had stuff like this that he kept to the end of his life, and this is now in the Beethoven Museum in Bonn, also is evidence of his sympathy for the French Revolution. If we move to one more image, though, there we get it too. This is Bonn, Germany, Beethoven's birthplace, 12th of October, 1794. And what it is the raising of the Liberty Tree on the marketplace. Beethoven's birthplace is just a few steps around the corner, and this is just after he left for Vienna. And this is an illustration. You see the French tricolor and the tree raised, and the French are liberating the German-speaking inhabitants of Bonn. It's remarkable, though, as depicted here, the Rhinelanders do not appear very enthusiastic because the line between liberation and new oppression is one that is very ambiguous. So let's move to the very next image past this. And this is a very famous one, but worth re-examining. It's in Beethoven's hand, and it refers to the Heroica Symphony, a breakthrough work Beethoven worked on in these years, finishes in 1804, and he writes Symphonie Grande and Titolita Bonaparte. You can still see the TE um, at the third system right-hand side, and you also see how Beethoven has forcefully erased Bonaparte there. And then 804 stands for 1804. He writes his name the French way, Louis van Beethoven, underneath it. But there's an ambiguity because he's also scrawled in pencil geschrieben auf Bonaparte below and not erased that, which means written on Bonaparte. This is significant because it both captures Beethoven's disgust when Bonaparte became a power politician and then an autocratic emperor starting in 1804. And it also shows Beethoven's lingering ambivalence toward Bonaparte. And I think the fascinating thing about this context too is that if one looks at it more closely, you realize that Beethoven's symphony has really only a superficial relationship to Napoleon Bonaparte. What it's much closer connected to is actually the myth of Prometheus. And Prometheus, if you recall your Greek from high school or whatever, Prometheus means pro. It's a forethinker who is a demigod, and Prometheus was the great champion in the mythic world of the Greeks of humankind. He's the one who stole the fire from the gods and brought it down to our level, and the self-consciousness that makes possible science and the arts is in this context only possible because of the Promethean sacrifice on behalf of humanity. And Beethoven was so fascinated by Prometheus that he wrote one particular theme, a contradance, associated with Prometheus in a ballet that he wrote called The Creatures of Prometheus. And the two creatures in this scenario are the original man and the original woman. And the Prometheus figure is really like a teacher of these original human representatives. And they finally, at the end of the ballet, start to recognize that what he has done on their behalf was significant, was important. And that theme, in turn, is the theme that Beethoven uses in the last movement of the Heroica Symphony, and writing that great work from the last movement backwards, it's the germinal idea of the entire symphony. So let's move to the next slide if we move forward. And this spirit of finding a connection between symbolic meanings and a kind of a gritty hold on musical expression is very typical, and it's embodied for reception history quite well in this poster that you see. And the poster includes the famous beginning of a later symphony, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in C minor. And what you hear, da pa pa pum, the three repeated notes that then go to the long note falling a minor third, or a major third actually. And the V reminds us that in later history, after Beethoven, when they developed the Morse code, it turned out that three shorts and a long became associated with V. And in 1941, during World War II, when the Axis powers, including Nazi Germany, seemed to be in a very strong position, a resistance movement turned up in Europe and spread very widely that associated the idea of resistance with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And sure enough, in the Second World War, it's striking that the Nazi regime, all try as they did to appropriate Beethoven's music, they were largely unsuccessful. And it's the Allies, in resistance to the totalitarian regimes, that were more successful in appropriating Beethoven for their cause. And this is rooted in Beethoven's original aesthetics and music, because, as we said, he was very attracted to Schiller's vision. And Schiller argued that in tragic works, in works of a darker quality, what is important is not simply that the artist depict melancholy or recognition of shortcomings in life, but rather resistance to that state of affairs. And so, in a work like the Fifth Symphony, which is one that I think you all know at least vaguely, the opening with its repeated note figure indeed is associated with a kind of stroke of fate or resistance to a tragic state of affairs. But by the finale, it breaks through to a brighter, more optimistic um, sphere, reinforced by extra instruments like the trombones and the piccolo. And Beethoven, in order to embody this narrative thrust that embodies the idea of resistance to troubles, and points toward possible overcoming of those troubles, he even incorporates a kind of episode in the middle of the last movement where it falls back into the minor sphere and then recaptures the shift to the major mode at the end. In short, it's a highly political work, which was so recognized much more recently. And you see the American flag next to those of the various nations that resisted um, during the period starting in 1941. Now, if we move to the next image, let's take a look at what there, that's from just before, actually the end of the 1930s. A French artist has depicted the brutality of the Hitler regime even before some of the most brutal things had happened. And you have the representatives of a German humanism in the form of Beethoven and Goethe saying, "What have you done to Germany?" accusing Hitler at this juncture. Um, so let's move to the next image after it. And here we have an interesting depiction, I think, of the monument that was erected to Beethoven in the year 1845. And as I mentioned, Beethoven died in 1827. That meant that as the years passed and one approached about a decade after the composer's death, that various musicians in particular thought it appropriate that there be a monument to this impressive composer who overcame his deafness to write such inspiring works of music. And so the movement arose around 1836 to raise funds for a monument. The composer Robert Schumann was involved with this. Franz Liszt, the famous pianist, who knew Beethoven on a personal level and had met, when he was quite young, had met the aging Beethoven in the 1820s. He was able to raise most of the money for the project. So this was erected in 1845, and it stood out because until that stage, most such monuments, and maybe many since, would be erected to political leaders or military leaders, and not often to cultural figures. So here, this fellowship of artists um, have the idea of raising at Beethoven's birthplace this monument to the composer, and it is erected in 1845. Well, the photograph by an American photographer was taken in the spring of 1945, exactly 100 years later, a century later. And what had happened then? The Second World War, the devastation of, of the Nazi regime, and the war. And now, as you see, the Münsterplatz, where this statue still stands, is just filled with debris, and the house to the left is simply burned out inside. And if you go to Bonn, you'll be able to easily locate that exact place with this statue and that building to the left. It's unchanged. Um, and what struck me was that in this picture in 1845, Beethoven's monument or his legacy seems to have almost miraculously um, emerged unscathed despite the destruction all around it. And that is um, largely the situation that I surveyed when I completed the last chapter of my recent book, concerned especially with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, with its setting of Schiller's um, To Joy, or An die Freude, this pre-revolutionary early poem by Friedrich Schiller. And the story there is fascinating too, that Schiller in later years thought that his poem To Joy maybe was not one of his best works. And when he was confronted with the option of including it in his collected works, he almost excluded it. Um, but it enthused Beethoven to his core, and he worked on it. He incorporated lines from it into his opera Fidelio in the middle of his career. Then he adapted it for the parts of it for the text of his final symphony, the Ninth, finished and first performed in 1824. And what was so unusual at that time was the incorporation of vocal soloists and chorus into the final movement of a symphony. And there were some people at the time who thought, oh, this symphony will hardly ever be performed because it requires these choral forces, and who's going to be able to arrange for that, and predicted that it would disappear. And how wrong they were, because the Ninth Symphony has become this kind of icon of affirmative culture in so many different contexts. Um, Maybe it conforms to the idea that Schiller developed called the effigy of the ideal. In other words, that if the artist confronted with a society and a history in which there are problems, um, confronted with a political sphere in which it's problematic, then what the artist should do is to make kind of images toward which we humans can strive, and maybe put them forth, making it clear that these are not yet attained, but nevertheless they have to be a goal toward which we direct our energies. And that's surely the way that we should understand Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It's probably a reason why at the beginning of the Ninth Symphony there is a very disordered, very dark, dissonant fanfare and chord, often described as the terror fanfare. And the earlier movements are recalled as if the work is almost unable to continue at all. And then, as a last effort, it searches further and it finds a folk song like tune, nothing ivory tower, nothing too esoteric, but something can be easily assimilated and for the most part, easily understood. And that then becomes the basis for a long series of transformations that do then take us to a threshold of the sublime. And I think there is another image beyond this one. Is there not? Yes. What I wanted to move to at this point, and I wanted to leave enough time for questions, but this is the final piano sonata of Beethoven's. It's one of a number of piano works that I've recorded, and it's something that plays an important role, for instance, in one of the great novels of the 20th century, Thomas Mann's novel Dr. Faustus. Thomas Mann, the author of The Magic Mountain and other important earlier works, was an opponent of the Hitler regime and forced to emigrate in the 1930s. And he ended up coming here to Los Angeles and spent a full decade in Pacific Palisades. And his house has recently become a cultural center. It was purchased by the federal government of Germany and a German foundation, and they have a very interesting program there. And in his novel, Dr. Faustus, in chapter 8, he has a narrative figure named Wendell Kretschmar who gives lectures to the Faustian protagonist of the novel. And the first of these concerns Beethoven's final sonata, Opus 111, and it refers to this piece as being an end without any return, a kind of a vision of plenitude, a kind of idealistic goal towards which we might strive again. So let's hear just the very end of this piece with its trills and elaborate textures. So that theme that you just heard, Beethoven dubs it an arietta, or a little song, writes transformations on it, and then toward the end of the piece, combines the levels, and we hear this sublime and very spiritualized version in which it's adorned by those sustained, vibrating trills and intoxicating figuration. And this very kind of fascinating musical configuration in the high register stands at the opposite pole from the beginning of the whole sonata, which starts with a highly tragic character, one that might be compared to Beethoven's treatment of the crucifixion and his Missa Solemnis, written around the same time. So I see that I've spoken for the greater part of an hour here, and I've forgotten the exact timeline, but we've covered a number of topics from Beethoven's youth in Bonn through his first years in Vienna, his engagement with Napoleon Bonaparte, the allegorical depiction by Mahler, the Fifth Symphony, and then a glance quickly at Beethoven's later years and works like the Ninth Symphony and Opus 111. I'm certain that some of you may have questions and comments, so why don't I stop at this point and listen to you?
Great, fantastic. Thank you. That was phenomenal. So everyone has the ability to unmute themselves. Feel free to type your question in the chat or just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Any questions?
I'm posting Bill's link to the University of Chicago Press, who published his book, in the chat right now. So if you want to see that, it's coming up shortly.
That's very kind. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Go ahead, Steve.
I was going to ask about the Heroica Symphony. I had read a great deal about that originally Beethoven wrote that or composed it in honor of Napoleon, but by the time he finished it, he soured on Napoleon, who really ran roughshod over Vienna and Austria. Is that true, or is that a myth?
It's aspects of it are true, but it's a complicated issue. Another aspect of this is Beethoven, as idealistic as he was in certain respects, he was also pretty shrewd in some of his actions. And around 1804, there's evidence that he contemplated moving to Paris. And if he had moved to Paris, it would have been, of course, a diplomatic move on his part to dedicate his big new symphony to the French leader. When he did not move to Paris, that was no longer a factor. It's also true that Beethoven was enthusiastic about Napoleon Bonaparte when he was first consul of the French Republic, and appeared to be a liberalizing figure. Beethoven invested much more hope in Napoleon Bonaparte politically than he did in Kaiser Franz. And there's evidence for this even years later that in Beethoven's circle, after Napoleon loses at Waterloo, and then he's at the island of St. Helena and so forth, Napoleon's totally out of the picture. There are sometimes conversations in Beethoven's conversation books. These are documents that exist because the composer had by then become stone deaf, and everybody had to write down their side of the conversation. And these indicate that Beethoven and his circle, they actually sometimes thought, well, things are so bad in Austria, maybe we would have been a little better off if Napoleon would have come back. And the paradox, you imagine, although in 1809, Napoleon defeating the Austrian armies occupies France, he occupies Vienna for the second time. And yet one of the repercussions of this is the censorship was relaxed. And so Beethoven wrote then one of his most political works, which was the music to accompany Goethe's Egmont in 1810. It's only possible because the French were occupying Vienna at the time. And so it was by no means a clear picture. In some respects, French occupation brought some liberalization as well as oppression, and the Austrian regime was consistently reactionary. And there's also evidence that that Kaiser Franz himself did not warm up to Beethoven at all. There's one source in which he apparently said that he was suspicious of Beethoven's music, and he said something revolutionary lurks in it. And and I think actually he was quite right. There was something revolutionary lurking there, and that's not something that the Austrian regime liked to see.
There is one question in the chat about what was the political subtext for Fidelio?
Oh, the political, that's very a good question in this context. Um, the political material of Fidelio goes back to a real life incident from the Reign of Terror, when so many people were guillotined in the wake of the French Revolution in 1793 to 94, and many innocent people were imprisoned, including, um, one figure who was important to Beethoven, named Eulogius Schneider, one of his most important teachers, went to France in the early 1790s, but ended up getting himself guillotined, um, because the political polarities were so strong. But the background to Beethoven's opera was the following: there was a judge, Boilly was his name, who became a, a figure of some importance in one of the French cities during the Reign of Terror. And he later described a situation in which he said that to the extent it was possible, he tried to shield innocent people in his role as accusateur public, and that he witnessed a situation in which a heroic young woman, who was the wife of an imprisoned kind of freedom fighter who had gotten himself on the wrong side of the revolution, um, that she smuggled herself into the prison as an employee and ended up liberating him and other prisoners. And so that was the basis for um, the opera that came to the Paris stage in 1798 with music by Gaveau, was the composer. And Gaveau, the composer, actually played the prisoner in those performances. And they were putting on the stage a scene from the excesses of the Reign of Terror just 5 years earlier. It was totally fresh material. Now, what happens with Beethoven is several years after that, Beethoven is living in the Theater an der Wien, recently revived as an opera house again, and he's given, because he has an opera contract, he's given an apartment right in the theater building, and he's going to performances often because he can just go from his apartment into the hall and hear these works. And there were a number of French operas being brought to the stage at that time. Beethoven was originally supposed to write an entirely different kind of opera, and he puts that aside, and because he's attracted to the political theme of Leonore, in other words, this French political rescue drama, and he has the text translated into German and revises it, and that was the first version of his drama Fidelio, brought to the stage in 1805, in which you have an imprisoned freedom fighter who's languishing in the dungeon, and that's also parallel, by the way, to the Marquis to Lafayette that I mentioned, who was only rescued from Austrian prison in the later 1790s through the invention of none other than Napoleon. So, in a way, the idea of an imprisoned freedom fighter who's rescued by his courageous wife, this resonates with that. But there's a more important aspect of this, I think, which is quite fascinating. The character of Leonora. Leonora is the real active heroine. The the male figure in Fidelio, he only has to stay alive and get rescued. Any heroism of his belonged to the pre-action of the drama, whereas it's Leonora who smuggles herself in, and she is a double-sided character because she's disguised. She disguises herself as a man, and therefore she works for the jailer. And she even is assigned to dig or open the cistern, which is to serve as the grisly prison or the burial space for her own husband in the dungeon scene. But at the key moment, she confronts the tyrannical figure, Pizarro is his name, maybe modeled on the French conqueror, actually. Um, and she confronts him and unmans the masculine tyrant at the moment that she reveals her femininity. And at this very moment, there's another dimension here which I think is thought provoking. When she reveals her femininity, she comes to stand as a symbol for liberation, and there is a sense in which she stands for the famous figure which became widespread in the wake of the French Revolution, because you might recall in revolutions, what happens often is that the despotic figure of a tyrant or a king, those statues will be destroyed out of hatred and overturning them. But in the French Revolution, they would knock them down, and then they would often reinstate another figure, and that figure was the classically robed feminine figure of liberté. And the Leonore figure in Beethoven's opera is basically embodying that as well. And you all know that figure, right? It's the same. It's identical to the famous gift of the French to the Americans in the later 1800s, the Statue of Liberty. Exactly the same thing.
Okay. So any other questions? Dan, go ahead.
Unmute.
I have some recollection. I have some recollection that at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, Leonard Bernstein conducted the Ninth Symphony. Went to Berlin. So it seems like yet another use of that. And also, I had some vague. This may be incorrect. That the original poem, the word Freude, which joy, was kind of a substitute for Freiheit, which you couldn't say for political reasons, but it was intended to be understood as Freiheit and not sort of some abstract joy. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, very interesting topic altogether. When in 1989, the Ninth Symphony had a couple of episodes of remarkable use. One, and I refer to this in my recent book, together with many other examples. On the 4th of June of 1989 was the first such instance. About 1 million students and other protesters converged on Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And at that point, things became very tense, and the government, unable to get the protesters to leave, were broadcasting propaganda and stern messages as the military were coming to Tiananmen Square. And the students gathered up car batteries and counter broadcast their own message to the authorities. And front and center in that was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as a symbol of liberation, and Beethoven had already assumed in China a very special significance before that, but that was a landmark. Now, a few months after that happened in China, in the fall of 1989, Beethoven's music assumed great importance in Germany in a couple of places. One remarkable appearance was in Dresden in October. And there was a performance there of Beethoven's opera Fidelio, and we just mentioned how it's an opera all about liberation and freedom. And there was a production there by Christina Mielitz, in which the depiction of the prisoners was made to resonate quite strongly with the prisons of the German Democratic Republic as well as the Third Reich. And they put the liberation scene with the prisoners in street clothes at the end, so that there was an identification of the audience with the characters on stage. And this all happened with 10,000 people protesting outside the Opera House in Dresden. 10,000. So it broke the boundary completely between what was happening outside and inside. And then and very shortly after that, there was the famous scene in Leipzig where the communist leaders were talking about das Volk, the people. And then the people started chanting back at them, "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people," and turned the tables on them. So now, just a few weeks after that, Leonard Bernstein comes to Berlin, and the wall has fallen. And so on Christmas Day is this performance of Beethoven's Ninth. And Bernstein, as you just said, he reaches back to an older tradition or a suspicion. It's never been proven. It's not that it's impossible, but since it's not been proven, it's just maybe going to always remain uncertain. The suspicion, as you mentioned, was that maybe in the 1780s, which was also a tricky time for Schiller, the period when he was writing his controversial early work, his other political works and so forth, whether Schiller meant to use the word Freude instead of, whether he was needed to use Freude instead of Freiheit. And the two words starting with F and with two syllables, they sound similar. So you can take the text to joy and turn it into a text or an ode to freedom very easily. And so Leonard Bernstein, knowing this tradition, he simply changed the text and made the ode to joy at the end of Beethoven's Ninth an ode to freedom. And after all, that was very fitting, because it was in Berlin where the death strip, the divided city, had just been reunified. And so it had multiple meanings all at once. And there are words there too that means there's this sense in Schiller of unity, which is very important. Schiller stressed that that the importance of the head and the heart, in other words, human rationality and the realm of the head and the realm of feeling, and that these needed to be unified. And so you had this sense of the message, you had the sense of the East and the West and the divided city, all of this being reunified in the name of freedom. So that's one reason why that performance became kind of etched into history and will remain that way for a long time.
Let me see if there's any more questions. Anyone have a hand up or any more questions? Go ahead, Steve.
Bill, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us. An absolutely fascinating talk. It's so good to know you're on campus and that we'll have plenty of opportunities of hearing you, probably musically, probably in talking in seminars. And it's a thrill, and thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure, great pleasure. And I might mention my book also has a companion set of audio samples. The playing that you heard is partly drawn from that. And I do also give concerts as a pianist, and look forward after as the pandemic subsides to doing some more of that as well.
Terrific.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to email the slides, if okay, Bill, to everyone if they want to see the slides at the end of the presentation, and put this on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't had a chance to check out our YouTube channel, we are archiving most of our speakers, those who allow permission to record it. So I'll put our YouTube channel in the chat. So you can always go back and see all of our Zoom presentations for the past year. They're all there, and I will add this one to it once it finishes uploading. So thank you again, Bill. It's great to see this wonderful program, and everyone have a great Thursday and have a good weekend.
Yeah,
Take
great
care.
pleasure. Nice to meet all of you.
Danke sehr, Herr Professor. Danke sehr.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wiedersehen.